Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Eno Center webinar. I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy. My name is Paul Lewis, Vice President of Policy here at Eno, and I'll be moderating the webinar today on sustaining UAS progress while pursuing a permanent regulatory framework. As many of you know, for many years, Eno has had an aviation working group, which is an advisory body for everything aviation. This is co-chaired by former Secretary of Transportation Jim Burnley, former Senator Byron Dorgan, a Republican, a Democrat who kind of steward and help guide a lot of the work and discussions and research. And the group consists of stakeholders across the industry, including airlines, airports, manufacturers, technology firms, labor unions, and others. The group has helped Eno tackle many complex issues like air traffic control reform, airport capacity, certification, airport privatization, and others. And last year, several members of the working group approached us and really said, look, it's time for Eno to focus on Unmanned Aircraft Systems policy, or UAS policy. As we've seen over the past couple of years, UAS can potentially offer a huge range of capabilities connecting people with goods and services. They have already started to replace the human element for dangerous inspections. They monitor environmental changes in remote locations. They have the potential to reduce carbon footprints of portions of the transportation network. But until UAS are safely integrated into the National Airspace Systems, these advances cannot be fully realized. Policymakers need to focus on safety and transparency for a permanent regulatory framework for UAS operators and manufacturers. Last week, Eno released a new report, Bridging the Gap, Sustaining UAS Progress While Pursuing a Permanent Regulatory Framework, that analyzes the current regulatory framework and creates a series of recommendations for the federal government and industry leaders on how to leverage a large body of existing work at the FAA to develop procedures, identify risks, and train workers effectively in UAS. This paper is available for download at enotrans.org. I encourage everyone to check it out. But today we're going to walk through some of those specifics, and we have with us here Ken Dunlap, who is the lead author on the paper, our subject matter expert, and Ken is really recognized as an international leader in helping businesses and the broader stakeholder community understand and develop strategies for procuring and deploying autonomous technologies across the board. He's the author of another report, a groundbreaking CUAS report, Countering Tomorrow, and he also hosts the Thinking Through Autonomy podcast, which is really excellent and highly recommended, in part because we're going to be getting the perspectives from several Eno Aviation Working Group members this fall as they talk through some of their perspectives on UAS. So I encourage everyone to follow the Thinking Through Autonomy podcast that Ken is the host of. Ken's firm, Catalyst Go, helps investors and end users deploy autonomous air and land technologies. He has advised the U.S. Department of Defense, investors, Fortune 500 companies on a range of UAS issues. He spent more than a decade at the International Air Transport Association, and he's also a pilot with thousands of hours flying both commercial and military aircraft. So I'm going to turn it over to Ken in just a minute, but just a quick note on format. We've got 45 minutes today. Ken will be presenting findings and recommendations, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have a question for Ken or for me at any time, please submit that via the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll then take those questions after Ken's presentation and ask them directly to him. For those that have already asked already, the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on Eno's website in just a few hours. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Dunlap, who's going to walk us through the paper. Ken.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was a really kind introduction, and I really appreciate it. Today, I'm going to focus on 4 key areas of our report. I want to start out with trust and the importance of trust, and why trust needs to be part of a discussion about unmanned aircraft. We want to talk a little bit today about how we collected the data and the mechanics behind that. We're going to introduce several key findings and then broadly survey the recommendations that are found in the report. Okay, I've got the technology back up, I think. Okay. So I want to start by talking about this basic proposition that is really woven through the entirety of the paper. And it's this, that until we get the full trust of the American public, both in the industry and in the regulator, in this case, the FAA, the unmanned revolution is not going to move forward. And that by itself, that's certainly not a groundbreaking, earth-shattering news. But what I think is important is that what we were able to find out through our research are 4 essential building blocks of trust. And that's safety, putting together a permanent regulatory framework, pacing oversight, FAA regulatory oversight with the technology, and putting together a set of regulations that are easy to understand and follow. And let me just break these 4 areas apart and maybe go into a little bit more detail on each one. Let's start by talking about safety. The vast majority of unmanned operators are new to aviation. In fact, they may not have ever heard of the Department of Transportation, and they may never have had to deal with the Federal Aviation Administration. And so because of that, there needs to be a safety culture that's woven throughout regulation and supported by voluntary data sharing, and sharing not only between the regulated party and the FAA, but also among the regulated parties. And the FAA has a role, we believe, and that's to teach best practices on how to fly safely and how to better recognize the risks that you may encounter, not only as you operate an unmanned system, but even construct an unmanned system. Next, there's the topic of a permanent regulatory framework. And why do we bring that up? That's because today's regulatory framework is based on essentially regulation by exception. And day-to-day flight operations, day-to-day building is being regulated through waivers and exemptions and deviations. And these type of mechanisms, these need to be reserved for unique circumstances and not form the day-to-day basis of regulation. Next, oversight needs to be paced with the technology. And if you look at how rapidly unmanned technology is developing, you find that the development cycles in many cases are measured in months and not years. And that's a tough paradigm to keep up with. And the FAA can't be expected to keep up when there's a high administrative burden involving essentially what we found is check the box paperwork. And in terms of easy to follow and easy to understand regulations, data shows that operators tell us that they want to be responsible, they want to fly safely, manufacturers want to build safely. But really, we're seeing confusion, and the data shows confusion on how to use the regulatory system around unmanned aircraft, and even something simple like how to file an application to use an unmanned system remains a mystery to some, and more clarity is needed throughout the regulatory system. So I want to start by talking about how we collected the data and go into what the data shows. Well, we distributed our own electronic survey, but we also referenced data contained in previous surveys from the Drone Advisory Committee and also our good friends over at AUVSI. And quantitatively, we analyzed all granted Part 107 waivers from 2017 until 2019. And then we sense checked what we found against what we've seen so far in 2020. We also analyzed all 44 807 petitions and decisions filed from December 2018 until September 2019. We examined over 880 exemption requests to individual sections of the FARs or the Federal Aviation Regulations, and we examined all the decisions released by the FAA during this time period. We also interviewed executives. And in terms of the systems that we considered unmanned systems, those used by hobbyists, all the way up to those that are commercially operated, but our report doesn't cover military systems at all. So one of the first things we did is we built a snapshot of the industry to answer what I think is a simple question, is who does what with unmanned aircraft systems? And this is what we found. The unmanned industry is dominated by small businesses. 75% of these businesses identify themselves as small, either in terms of annual revenue or the number of employees that they have. So that's a standard US government definition. 64% report revenue of less than about $1 million per year. And for unmanned systems under 55 pounds, and the reason we use 55 pounds is because that weight is a dividing point in the regulations. We find that drone operators essentially do 4 things: photography, inspection services, agricultural, and flight testing. These are the top uses, and they are evenly divided among the responders to our survey. But if you take a look at the story above 55 pounds, it's largely different and really incredibly surprising. 67% of all users focus on agricultural and heavyweight photography. Only about 7% of the applicants have sought to apply for package delivery. And then if we look at aircraft and production certification, we find a really highly specialized activity conducted only by a handful of well-capitalized manufacturers. The next thing we did is we mapped out the overall regulatory framework covering unmanned operations. And what we found, as I said earlier, is that regulation is almost exclusively done on a by exception basis. And you're probably asking, what does regulation by exception mean? Well, we mean what we're seeing today is a regulatory process whereby operators and manufacturers have to apply for things called waivers and exemptions and deviations from the FAA because the existing body of regulations largely doesn't address many use cases. So for instance, in Part 107, which is the entry point for unmanned regulations for systems, again, under 55 pounds, there's a basic set of rules, but it doesn't allow things like package delivery, or unless you have a waiver, flying at night, flying beyond line of sight, which we call BV loss, or even one pilot controlling multiple aircraft. If you want to do these and several other categories of operations, then in fact you have to apply for a waiver from the FAA. Section 44807, that applies to unmanned aircraft weighing over 55 pounds, those carrying hazardous material. And what do we mean by that? Typically agricultural chemicals, so fertilizers or pesticides. 44807 also applies to drone delivery. And in these cases, if you want to do these things with your system over 55 pounds, then you need to apply for an exemption from the FAA. And finally, if you want to carry property for hire, fly among manned aircraft, carry people for hire, or do one of other several complex and perhaps riskier things with an unmanned aircraft, then you need to consider full aircraft certification and production certification. But to make that decision, that involves a complex calculus for any manufacturer. We examined all the regulatory mechanisms that I've been speaking about in our research. And I'd like to highlight several of the findings, starting with the basics, which is Part 107. What we found is that the number of waiver approvals processed by the FAA has remained relatively constant over the 3-year period that we looked at, with a mean of about 1,090 approvals granted each year by the FAA. And note, I specifically use the word approvals, and that's because the FAA doesn't release any information on rejected waivers. So we don't know what that body of waiver rejections look like. And in the chart you see, ENA data is represented in blue and FAA data is represented in green. And these are the types of waivers that are being requested, those that are being granted, and in the ratios that they're being granted. Now, night waivers, that means operating an unmanned system at night, represent the largest category of waiver granted by the FAA, and those represent about 88% of all waiver approvals. Yet, ENO found an equally large number of requests are being made for waivers other than night, and they're not being approved in similar proportion. And so you're probably wondering, why is there this disparity in the Part 107 waiver approval process? And a number of factors have been revealed in our research, and I just want to go through 4 of those. The first one is the FAA might have a better understanding of night operations. They understand the risks. They have experience with night operations. And so they may have a process that's optimized for granting night waivers. Also, another thing to consider is that higher risk activities are present in other categories. But on the other side of the coin, cut and paste night waiver templates are easily obtained via the internet. And also, some operators might be performing these operations without seeking any type of regulatory approval whatsoever. Now, prior to the creation of Part 107, Section 333 was the primary regulatory framework for unmanned aircraft, and literally thousands of exemption requests were filed with the FAA every year. And then we had Part 107 arrive, and Section 44807 was created for uses like vehicles that are heavyweight, so again, over 55 pounds, package delivery, getting that burrito delivered to your front door, or carrying hazardous chemicals. And our data shows that with the introduction of Part 107, Section 44807 petition requests went from thousands per year to just about dozens per year. And another surprise in this data set is that the petitions that we saw under 44807 are dominated by agriculture, dominated by heavyweight photography. And I guess it kind of appears that farmers and Hollywood do have something in common. But more importantly, one of the things we found in the data is a common vehicle weight. And that vehicle weight is for a vehicle weighing about 75 pounds. And why is 75 pounds a common weight? Well, it appears to be based on the fact that there are a certain family of vehicles that are commercially manufactured that are commonly used for these purposes. There were also several other data points that we extracted from Section 44807 data. The most notable of which is the exemption processing time by the FAA doesn't align with industry development cycles. This then becomes a limiting factor in a manufacturer developing subsequent generations of unmanned vehicles. If you look at the top chart displays the median time for hearing back from the FAA on the success or failure of your petition request under Section 44807. If you're approved, you're probably going to know back in a median of 145 days. If you're rejected, your median time is closer to 179 days. And also, who files your exemption petition also has an impact on whether or not you're going to be successful. Entities that use a third-party preparer are rejected only about 5% of the time. If you file yourself, you're going to have a denial rate that's closer to 32% of the time. And this is represented by the pie chart and the bar chart in the lower right side of this slide. Our interviews with industry executives showed that the shortcomings of the exemption process have created a cottage industry around preparation of petitions and the ability to fast track them to regulators. And further, participants in the Unmanned Integration Pilot Program, which you may have also heard called the IPPs, are perceived to have a competitive advantage in receiving exemption requests from the FAA. In Section 44807, we also looked at 880 requests for exemptions to individual federal aviation regulations, the FARs. What we found is an administrative burden arising from the need to translate manned regulations into unmanned regulations. And much of this translation is driven by the simple fact that a pilot, by definition, is not on board an unmanned aircraft. And these aircraft don't contain all the traditional systems you might find on a manned aircraft. The chart you're seeing right now outlines 15 sections of the federal aviation regulations where we found cookie cutter exemptions being granted almost 100% of the time. And I'd highlight categories like seat belts, fuel requirements, private pilot license limitations, shoulder harnesses, and required documents to be carried on board an aircraft as examples of these. There were also 14 areas where exemption requests were denied almost 100% of the time. And the majority of these were found in exemptions for commercial use of unmanned systems. This data is for the period under review. We note that last week Amazon received a 44807 exemption approval and UPS and Wing did so in the year prior. This would change the current data set only by a few percentage points, as numerous other operators have made requests and have been denied. Finally, we looked at aircraft and aircraft production certification. And what we found is that these activities are highly specialized and conducted only by a few companies. And why is that? These are very expensive undertakings. They take a great deal of time, and the time's measured perhaps in years. And we found these processes are commonly used for repurposing military platforms for commercial use and unmanned delivery. Our data shows that the FAA continues to view unmanned aircraft certification and production certification through the lens of manned aviation, which again involves translating one set of rules into another set of rules. And there are two concerns we found specifically that I'd like to highlight. First, there appears to be greater than expected reassignments and turnover of FAA oversight personnel assigned to certification. And this in turn leads to interruptions in the certification process. And second, participants felt that FAA skill sets are often mismatched to the unmanned aircraft industry. And that's to say that FAA personnel might not have experience in unmanned aircraft certification, instead, manned aircraft certification. And finally, certification is hindered by component approvals and radio spectrum issues. One of the primary uses for this process is, as we've discussed, converting unmanned military systems to commercial use. And these face the issue of the approval of mil-spec parts. And mil-spec parts are parts and components of airframes that meet Department of Defense specifications, but don't have approval for use in a civilian system. And an adjunct to this is the use of COTS, the commercial off-the-shelf parts. Rules around the use of these and attaining the proper approvals to use these parts remains uncertain. We also noted issues with baseline reliability requirements, and these are being based on electrically powered vehicles. Also, another issue is the need to consider ODA or other designated authority for unmanned aircraft operation production. And finally, we noted that radio spectrum is not part of the certification process at all, but it operates largely in parallel. Unmanned aircraft, of course, need to communicate with the ground and potentially at some point with one another. Further research, we believe, is needed about integrating radio spectrum in the certification process and protecting these frequencies from interference. And now over to the recommendations. Proposed 28 policy recommendations, and I'd like to go through a high-level overview of each section. There's seven general recommendations that focus on 4 areas. The first of which is the sharing of information between and among the industry and the FAA, creating a robust regulatory roadmap specifically aimed at creating a safety and accountability culture within the unmanned industry, and then creating a roadmap for regulatory reform with certain milestones and timelines that are written down. And finally, we encourage streamlining pro forma requests and administrative matters. Our recommendations on Part 107 focus on streamlining Part 107 processes and using Part 107 to educate and inform these new entrants on safety, and specifically aviation safety. This includes helping unmanned operators understanding risks, hazards, safe ways to fly, and the not so safe ways to fly unmanned vehicles. And that also applies to the safe way of constructing vehicles and the unsafe ways of constructing unmanned vehicles. And also, we focused on recommendations to lessen the administrative burden on the FAA so that the agency itself can focus on safety and education. This includes processes for streamlining approvals for commonly understood low-risk operations and helping applicants prepare high-quality waiver applications. Regarding Section 44807, we focus recommendations on streamlining the exemption process for vehicles in the 75-pound class category, those carrying agricultural chemicals, and those flying heavy cameras. The 15 most approved exemptions we discussed earlier, those should be the focus of a streamlined approval process. And finally, the FAA needs better information and provide that to users to help them choose between Section 44807 and aircraft certification and production certification, because the lines between these remain very blurred. And finally, we had a series of recommendations on aircraft and production certification. These focus on 4 areas, all centered on making the process more predictable, and they include modernizing the federal aviation regulations to recognize the specific needs and differences of unmanned vehicles, new processes and funding to expedite approval of mil-spec parts and COTS parts, integrating radio spectrum into the certification process, and in fact allowing for peer review of data and durability models by which an unmanned aircraft system is evaluated. Those are the recommendations. Paul, I'm going to turn it over back to you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ken, for that. That was a great overview of the paper and some of our findings. Again, for those of you on this live webinar, if you have a question for Ken or for me, please go ahead and type that into the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel. We've got a bunch of questions that have came in already, and they kind of are divided into 2 parts. And the first questions are kind of more specifics about the study and some of the data. Others are kind of forward-looking and kind of thinking about what happens next.
Sure.
And so let's talk about some of them on the report first, and some of them that I want to pose to you as kind of moderator's privilege. But obviously we went through a ton of data here. This is an industry, Ken, that you've been following for a long time. What's the most surprising thing that you found in the study when you look at the different questions that came up and the different data points?
Well, Paul, that kind of smacks me on the back of the head, because I think the thing that I found most surprising was the difficulty in collecting data on Part 107 waivers that were not approved, or Part 107 waivers that weren't reflected in the FAA database. One of the things we did is we said, we need to directly contact the actual users who are applying for Part 107. And so between us and our partners at the Aviation Working Group, we put together a list of almost 52 or 53,000 people to contact who we believed had experience in asking for a waiver or were senior executives. And we contacted them almost 115,000 times. We put information in the trade press, and as fate would have it, our survey sample is only 85 people. But the survey sample for the DAC, that's equally small. That's just about 600. So despite the fact that there are all these wedge issues out there, there are issues that people are feeling very vocal about. They seem to be unwilling to supply the data and participate in an effort to understand what's going on. I mean, that was probably the big surprise. Now, I will say this, if someone hears, well, DAC only had 600 ANT survey respondents, we only had 85. One of the things we did with our survey is we had a series of control questions put in our survey that mirrored other surveys that we had seen. So that way, that's how we validated our data. So on the control questions that we took from the DAC survey, we were within 1 or 2% of their findings as well. So we feel really confident in that. But, I would have expected out of the 50,000 people that there would be a larger population. And then maybe the question is, why didn't people participate? And I think there's evidence to suggest, A, there's survey fatigue. People are tired of answering surveys. The other thing is there might be the feeling that if I participate in another survey, it's not going to change things. It's not going to change the government. It's not going to change industry. But also, this came out in our data as well, Paul, as you know, is that there is an incredible amount of evidence that you can find just by going to YouTube that people are doing many of the activities that require waivers under Part 107 and not seeking the waivers.
Got it. So, I mean, is that related to the fact that maybe it's challenging to fill out a 107 application? What can you kind of give us a sense for how long it takes to fill out a Part 107 application and what disincentives might be there for folks to do that?
Yeah, sure. So my overall comments are based on the fact that we are dealing with brand new people to aviation. They don't deal with FAA on a regular basis, if at all. So there appears to be the need for a lot of hand-holding through the application process. And what we found is, a couple interesting facts. The first one is that it typically takes about 40 hours or less to fill out a Part 107 waiver, and you'll hear back from the FAA in about 60 days, and that's supported in our data. And the whole 107 process could be used a lot more, I think, for education. And then the other thing too is there is a myth supported by data where there's confusion with the Part 107 application process, and that, for instance, if I go and put out a Part 107 application for daylight, which is the same thing, a daylight waiver, which means I want to fly my unmanned aircraft at night, then I might be asked by the FAA for additional information not related to flying at night at all. And our data shows that we've had operators that have applied for flying at night, who's also have been asked for additional information about flying that vehicle from a car, or maybe one pilot flying multiple systems. And so it shows two things. A, the process isn't well understood, and B, applicants are unprepared to address safety issues that are not right down that narrow road that they were expecting to have to address.
Got it. So a couple questions here coming on about the distinction between the commercial side and the hobbyist side. Is there a need or a role for a lobby group for hobbyists and industry, and kind of how does that dynamic playing out as these are rolling out, and not just hobbyists, drone hobbyists, but any kind of model aircraft or plane hobbyists? How do those things mesh together?
Yeah, so that's kind of like the $1 million wedge question right now, and in a way, that's almost like the third rail question. If you answer that, one side or the other is going to shock you. So the point on this is there are exceptions that are allowed for operating unmanned aircraft within the realm of a community-based organization, and that's probably not as fully defined as it should be. There are advocacy groups for that. I think of the Academy of Model Aeronautics, which handles mostly the fixed wing side, and the non multi-rotor groups of users. But I think that community spoke loud and clear on the remote ID NPRM when there were over 50,000 comments that were presented to the FAA that they need to go and look through and see what the sense of that community is. So I think if there's a message, there needs to be an emphasis by the FAA on that community, a community that is, large and passionate, and recognized too in all of this. That's the community where we get our future engineers from, our future pilots from, our future regulators from. And so the more you can make that process for the hobbyist incentivized, the more it's going to pay off throughout the entirety of the unmanned industry. And I think that the FAA is getting that message.
Got it. Question here about remote ID. The participant says, I didn't hear you mention remote ID. How can these recommendations help inform FAA regarding its ongoing rulemaking on remote ID, and how do these things mix together?
Yeah, I think it, it goes back a little bit to what we were just discussing about FAA understanding the segmentation of the unmanned aircraft users. I mean, you'll always have, three groups. You'll have the high altitude, long endurance aircraft that are designed to fly through the national airspace, get up to 60,000 feet and perform missions. Then you'll have the local delivery people. Then you'll have the folks who do agricultural applications, photography, and the last group would be the hobbyists. And I think there has to be a paradigm that says, first off, we need to recognize the segmentation of the users, and we need to put that in the federal aviation regulations because it's really not there. And once we do that, we have to do a better job of outreaching to each one of those communities because it kind of seems that the community that speaks the largest is getting all the bandwidth. And I think if anything, what this shows is that if you have these standalone NPRMs that come out, so whether it's flight over people, whether it's remote ID, that unless they're tied together by some sort of regulatory framework, that they're not going to solve the problems that are out there. So maybe, and this is not a message in the paper, but a message that we've certainly been thinking about is that maybe a lot of emphasis needs to go on to putting that framework together, working the framework and seeing what from the manned world can be taken to the unmanned world, getting those regulations together, and then tackling the common use cases like that. But I think the message is loud and clear. Unless you have milestones and timelines and a structure that is based on safety and a structure based on efficiency and regulation, you're going to continue with the same issues we're seeing now.
Got it. So another question coming in about educating UAS operators. How do we work with UAS operators to inform them of some of the risks and dangers and proper procedures around places like residences, train yards, bus stations? The participant also lists automotive testing grounds, aviation manufacturing facilities, first responder station, airport facilities. I mean, there's lots of different places where UAS operations could be hazardous to multiple users. How do we work with the UAS operators to make sure that those operations are safe?
So I want to divide this question up into two parts. For the 99.9% of all unmanned aircraft operators that are the good citizens who want to operate safely. And then I want to talk about that 0.1% that are the so-called rogue drone operators. So I'm a manned aircraft pilot. And before I ever jumped into my first airplane, I could get a book from the FAA, the Airman's Information Manual. And there is a huge body of written material that helps a person figure out what it means to be a pilot, what it means to operate safely. And there are examples, like this is a safe way to do it. This is an unsafe way. So that body of knowledge is there. And the second thing in the manned world, there's a great deal of information sharing. So you can pick up one of your popular flying magazines and there will be something, and there's usually a chapter there called, I learned from that. And it'll say, I was a great pilot until I did these 10 stupid things. And when I did that, I caused some adverse action that I didn't like. And so there's industry sharing of information. And so I think if you get knowledge together that can be relied on to say, this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way, these are the consequences if you do it the wrong way, and then you get the industry to share information, I think that's a really good foundation for moving ahead. Now, the second part of the question is, what if you have, I think they were called once by one of the assistant administrators at the FAA, the dumb and the dangerous unmanned aircraft operators. One of the situations we're facing right now is that enforcement is a complete mess. And there are no clear lines of what local communities can enforce. I mean, there was a letter from the FAA deputy administrator several years ago that says, you can control where they take off, but the FAA is going to control where they fly. That really doesn't provide enough guidance. And the other thing is when you come to, state authorities, tribal authorities, federal authorities, the enforcement mechanisms are just, they're not there. And so without the enforcement mechanisms, people are gonna, the rogue operators, and say, I'm gonna do whatever I wanna do. And then the other thing, this is probably part of another webinar, Paul, is that we need to do a better job of having communities, local communities, identify poor drone behavior in a collective way that supports law enforcement and that supports identification of these people, so that they can be stopped from what they're doing. And I'm thinking you need to crowdsource that activity rather than think I'm going to spend $20 million on this counter drone technology and put it at the top of my building and shoot down everything around. That has absolutely probably not the dollar value people are expecting.
Got it. Another question is, some kind of future thinking, and this is where we're going to recognize some of the limits of this particular study, and maybe you can opine on some of these things. But
sure.
The participants asking, how will the separation between UAS and pilot-operated aircraft be maintained, particularly around airports, kind of regardless of the different class?
Yeah, and that's the other $10 million question. But I think there's good news on that. NASA has been very proactive on putting together ideas for UTM, unmanned traffic management. And if you look globally right now, there's about 24 or 25 different papers out there on different mechanisms that can be used. But recently out of the FAA, we understand that they have interest in a federated system, meaning there's not going to be one global control tower in the sky watching every drone everywhere. I think another part of this is for those platforms that need remote ID, that there will be a remote ID requirement / equipage requirement at some point. But I do think that that's a huge question, and that's going to involve making sure the interests of the American public come first, meaning we don't want an unmanned aircraft to drop on our head. We don't want an unmanned aircraft to go to a big event and interrupt that event, and that we know that there's an enforcement mechanism in there as well. That I think is really going to need a lot of study, and especially when you see the different, I'll just add, we have options, for that, from maybe somebody logging into a web app, to having a transponder on an aircraft, to having radar antennas to track unmanned aircraft. And there are going to be different price points, which make this national policy, I think it'll become obvious when we look at what costs and what are the benefits from each of these. But that cost benefit analysis is really yet to be done.
Got it. So that leads into my last question, because we're almost out of time. And this is the future, right? So Ken and I spent a lot of time, once we were kind of wrapping up this paper, talking to the folks on ENO's aviation working group about what comes next, right? This report was, I think, our first step into this space. We came across a lot of really interesting data. We have some really compelling recommendations, but one of the big things we found is that there's an awful lot to do. Can you talk through kind of the three areas of research that we're thinking are kind of the next step for this group, and kind of what that would entail, and what kind of questions we would answer there?
Sure. I think the big question is, what is safety? I probably use that word 10 times today, and the question needs to be delineated as, what does it mean to be safe to fly? What does it mean to have a safe vehicle? And what is the safety culture that you need to put into regulation? So, when I open up the FARs, I can see a continuous thread of safety through it, but also as a business. So as a business entity, what it means to be safe from the point you launch a vehicle, your ramp, all the way through your boardroom, so that nobody who has responsibility in that organization doesn't know what it means to be safe. Then I think there are other areas to look at as well. I use the word enforcement several times today. And it's how do you enforce and put together a body of code that actually incentivizes people to fly responsibly and gets those folks that are being irresponsible or dumb or dangerous operators? And, so I think there's a number of permutations and all that, and that's all capped off by this thing called UTM, Unmanned Traffic Management. And if I think there's a future for research, it probably goes down one of those three forks, Paul.
Great. No, that's great. And the group will be reconvening this fall. This is something we're very excited to do virtually to kind of talk through which one to prioritize those. I think that, obviously safety first is a priority for ENO and something that this research really was pointing towards, but the other ones are just as important, kind of cracking some of the nut and answering some of the questions that came in on the phone today or on the chat function today. So with that, I certainly want to thank you, Ken, for your remarks, your expertise, your assistance with putting together this research and the paper. I think it's really a good foundation for kind of the future of this work. I also want to let other folks on the phone know that this is hardly the last time we're going to dip our toe in this. You should definitely all follow the Thinking Through Autonomy podcast that Ken is the host of. We're going to be releasing a series coming up later this month, of perspectives on this issue from various stakeholders around the industry. And so it'll be really insightful, I think, for folks to tune into that, get some better sense for how people are thinking about UAS and UAS policy. And we're also going to be continuing to brief people and talk about these issues. So thank you very much for tuning in. And again, thank you, Ken, for all the hard work. And we'll be talking with all of you very soon. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.